Welcome, everybody, to the continuation of True Crime in Ancient Times at the Getty Villa Museum. My name is Shelby Brown, and I'm very happy to be hosting this talk today. We will have very few housekeeping announcements and then go straight to the main event. But I would like you to know that this is being recorded and will be on our webpage and on Getty's YouTube channel shortly. And also that you can put your questions in as they come to you throughout the talk, and we will get to them right at the end as soon as we're done. Um, I would like to turn right away to David Saunders. David has been at the Getty since 2008, and he received his doctorate from Oxford University in classical archaeology. He's an expert on Greek and South Italian vase painting, although he has curated many exhibitions not focused explicitly on vases. And a little bit more about David will be going into the chat, along with some links to images that he's showing. David is especially interested in iconography of the wounded, the dying, and the dead. And that ties directly into his talk today. So I'm going to transition right away to the corpse on the shore with David.
Thank you, Shelby, and good afternoon or good day to all of you. Thank you for joining us and joining me for this little focus on a single object in the Getty's collection. And as Shelby said, my doctoral dissertation now some years ago was on dead and dying figures, and I can never, it seems, escape them. They keep coming back to me. But this particular object is one that I am endlessly fascinated by and is one of my favorite objects in our collection. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk about it a little bit with you all this afternoon. I'm not going to make too much of a big deal about the kind of true crime theme that this whole week has. This is really just a sort of hook to hang this talk on, but we are going to be looking at a corpse, as my title suggests, and trying to unpack who this person is and why we encounter this body. What's the sort of backstory? So there is a certain, I suppose, detective-y component to what we'll be doing. I should say, for everyone, this is a story that does involve someone who takes their own life by their own hand, and this is a upsetting and distressing topic. And indeed, I think this is actually one of the sort of engaging components of this particular cup, and it sort of compels us to explore some of these issues and how they were understood, how they were considered by the ancient Greeks, particularly in the 5th century BC. So, to get sort of straight into business, we are looking at a Athenian terracotta cup made of clay, produced at the very beginning, maybe around 490, 480, early in the 5th century BC, in what we call today the red figure style. So the cup, as you see, is painted black, and then the figures are left the color of the clay, the so-called red or orange color. So it's a very simple, in some senses, decorative technique, but allows the painters an enormous fluidity and variability for the scenes and images that they show. And as I said, this is a drinking cup made for the consumption of wine. It's substantial. I've given you the dimensions on the slide. It's about 40 centimeters across, including the handles. So this is a fairly large vessel. And I show you here a detail of it in profile, so you can see it from the side. And you'll see it's a very shallow bowl. This is not a cup that is made for heavy drinking. This is not like a flagon of ale or some such. This is a cup for careful sipping of wine. And this is a standard shape produced by the Greeks for centuries that was fundamental to drinking in the symposium. And the symposium, which is a word that we use today to describe scholarly conferences, for the ancient Greeks, the symposium was an evening event involving men, and typically only men, coming together to enjoy one another's company over wine. And these cups were integral to that whole experience. And as we will explore a little bit today, the images on them, I really want to suggest to you are kind of prompts for discussion, prompts for contemplation in this setting of the symposium. The symposium is a place where men who are friends, peers, comrades come together, enjoy one another's company, their wit, their musicality, their jokes, their knowledge, their expertise. And so it's a sort of place to savor storytelling, it's a place to savor wine. And so, in some senses, this sort of shallow wine cup is expressly designed for that sort of experience of savoring storytelling, of savoring drinking, of savoring company together. To sort of dwell on this kind of aspect of wine drinking a little more, and this is a very kind of crude way of representing it, and I'm sure many of you are far more skilled at animation than I am, but I've sort of included this detail just to kind of highlight when you would begin drinking from this cup and it was full of wine, you would not be able to see the image on the interior. And so the process of drinking from this cup, of sipping away at the wine on the inside, gradually reveals this shocking image on the interior. And so there is this sort of process of revelation, this process of encounter for the drinker as they consume their wine. And that's, I think, kind of nicely played off against the scene that we actually see on the inside, which we'll talk about in more detail, but shows a woman rushing to cover the body of this corpse. So there's this sort of play between the image that is initially hidden, that you then reveal, and then that image itself shows a woman covering the body that is lying on the shore. So let's look a little bit more closely at the image itself. This is what we call the Tondo, the interior of the cup, and it provides this sort of round portal-like snapshot, if you will, framed by this meander pattern around the perimeter. And it really kind of zeroes us in. This is something maybe I'll sort of come back to, but almost, I don't know, cinematic. So it's very much like a camera focusing on this distinct episode. As you see here, and this kind of moment of almost climactic discovery. And what you see here is the body of a adult male lying on his back. He is naked, as is the sort of standard way of representing heroes. And he is lying, maybe I'll show you a detail, with his head cast back. You can see his beard projecting upwards. His eye is still open, but the pupil is rolled back up to the top of the eyelid. His hair is sort of streaming down around his shoulders. His left arm slung out by his side. His right kind of flexed back behind his head, and his body is, as I say, laid supine on its back on what seems to be a rocky shoreline. And above, as you see, a woman is rushing. She is heavily draped, her hair also flowing behind her head, and she is stretching out a big cloak, essentially to cover the body and to evidently provide it with some degree of dignity in this moment of exposure. And then if you look really closely, you'll see in the detail, fixed in the man's sort of back, in his flank, is a sword. And you can see the tip of the sword emerging out the other side. And looking at the Tondo broadly, you can also see the scabbard at about, 2 o'clock in the Tondo. The scabbard in which the sword would have been held is now empty, and the blade is fixed in the body of this individual. Now, if you are all here with me in the galleries, and I should say this cup is on display at the Getty Villa, at this point I would maybe solicit your thoughts on who is depicted. Since we don't have that opportunity for direct engagement, I will sort of tell you from the outset, this is the Greek hero Ajax. And Ajax, as we see him here, has committed suicide. Ajax was one of the leading heroes in the Greek army when they were fighting at Troy, really second to Achilles. And what we are seeing here is this horrific and climactic moment where he has taken his own life, and his captive war prize Tecmessa, who is the woman you see standing above him, is rushing to cover Ajax's corpse to provide at least some dignity. So this is an episode from Greek myth. We are dealing with a figure of, should we say, superhuman proportions, of superhuman scale, and the painter has sort of conveyed this. You'll see at the in the main scene that Ajax's feet kind of overlap the actual Tondo perimeter. He's too big for the scene. It kind of really is a sort of effective way of showing just how heroic and sort of grandiose Ajax is as a figure. He can't be contained within the boundaries of this image. Now, if this story is familiar to you of Ajax's suicide, it's one you may know from a play that survives by the playwright and poet Sophocles. Sophocles writes an extraordinarily powerful play called The Ajax, which dramatizes the final moments of Ajax's life and really provide an insight into his thinking. There's this extraordinary soliloquy where he weighs up his life and looks back and looks ahead and deliberates on the right path to take. This play was written, we believe, around 440 BC. This cup, however, was painted a good 50 years earlier. So Sophocles is already using a story that was well known at the time. It's already at least 50 years old and is in circulation. And this is very typical for many of the images we see on Greek pottery or more broadly in Greek art. These are stories that were circulating for centuries and maybe only later written down or survive in texts that post-date, that follow after the ancient images. And so you have a glimpse into a storytelling culture and mythology that was really enduring over centuries. And in fact, the story of Ajax is something we can trace back at least to the 7th century BC, both in images and in texts. And while this particular representation of Ajax's suicide is, as far as I know, unique, with this composition and Tecmessa coming to cover the body, we have a number of earlier images that show Ajax's suicide. And I show you one example here. This is about 100 years, maybe a little more than 100 years earlier than the cup at the Getty. And this is today on a vase on a big mixing bowl that is in the Musée du Louvre in Paris. And on the left, you see a photograph. And on the right, I've included a drawing I was able to find on Wikimedia, which at least helps decipher. It's a rather faded and eroded scene, and I've included the drawing so it's a little bit clearer. And here again, you see Ajax, in this case, lying prone, lying prostrate, head down, with a sword fixed through his middle and actually spurting blood, lying on the ground. And conveniently, the painter has named all three figures in this scene. So you have Ajax's name just above his head. And you'll see he's also wearing a helmet and wearing shin guards, indicating that he's a warrior. And this is a scene that we know of, as I say, from a number of other Greek drinking cups and other vessels, oil jars, and on other media, on ivory and bronze and so forth. So it's a fairly widely circulating representation. And this is clearly an episode that was well known and a subject of interest. One particular thing I like about this particular vessel is, in contrast to the cup at the Getty, the cup at the Getty sort of telescopes us as the viewer into this moment. We have this kind of really intimate and very personal, almost witnessing of the dead body, with Tecmessa coming to cover it. We, as the viewer or the drinker holding this cup, can act as the spectator and sort of encounters this body for the first time. In this earlier scene, what we see instead are these two warriors who are acting as spectators. They're sort of encountering this body themselves. And so they sort of provide a framework for how we might look at this corpse. And conveniently, as I said, they are also named. They are Diomedes and Odysseus. So both members of the Greek army coming across Ajax's body and facing, what needs to happen next. And one of the most extraordinary details in this vase, and this is kind of one of the main reasons I wanted to include it. I'm obviously a big fan of Greek vase painting, but by and large, whilst there are a number of ways that painters and artists convey emotion, it tends to be a fairly narrow range of gestures and expressions. There's not much. It quickly gets quite stereotyped. And one of the really striking things about this particular scene is if you look at the figure standing on the left, the way he holds his hand to the back of his neck is something. It's a really kind of distinctive gesture, and one that I'm not being able to find many parallels for, but is so expressive. You can almost hear him saying, like, "Oh my goodness," this is kind of almost before the horror. It's like the sheer shock of discovery, and it's this sort of wonderful kind of little vignette that kind of really kind of takes us to this shocking moment of encounter. So I could wax lyrical about these scenes for hours, but to step back a little bit, why is Ajax taken this step to take his own life? What is the backstory that has sort of led to this climactic moment? Well, returning to the cup at the Getty, the exterior, the outside, provides us with this brilliant digest, this brilliant assemblage of two preceding scenes, two episodes that provide the backstory to this whole event. This is where we sort of have to cut away for a little bit and go back to the Trojan War. The Greeks have been fighting at Troy for 10 years, all with a view to recovering Helen. And as I say, they are in their final year of this siege. This is the time that the Iliad recounts. And after the Iliad finishes, the Iliad ends with Achilles killing of Hector, Achilles dragging of the body of Hector, and then his ransoming to Priam, the king of Troy, of the corpse of Hector. Thereafter, there is still lots more fighting to do. And ultimately, Achilles himself dies. You know the story perhaps of Achilles' heel. He gets wounded by Patroclus. I'm blanking on who. By Paris, and Achilles dies. And this is a terrible moment for the Greek army. They need to recover the body of Achilles. He is their eminent hero. And they don't want the Trojans to hold on to Achilles' body because they may desecrate it or injure it or wound it. And the Greeks want to honor Achilles appropriately. So they have to undertake a mission to bring back Achilles' body from Troy. Fortunately, they are able to do so through the leadership and skill and bravery of Ajax and Odysseus. They bring back the body of Achilles. The Greeks are able to bury the body, and conceivably they then are able to kind of resume fighting again. However, Ajax and Odysseus are very invested in this whole experience, and they come to blows as to who really deserves credit, who deserves the utmost respect for recovering the body of Achilles. And it comes down to who is going to be awarded the prize of Achilles' armor. And both Ajax and Odysseus, as eminent warriors in the Greek camp with big, big egos, come to fighting as to who deserves honor and respect. And on the one side of this cup, you see Ajax and Odysseus on either side, literally having to be forced apart by other members of the Greek camp. And this cup, as you see, is a little bit fragmentary. I'll show you another example in a moment, which is a bit more complete. But you can see in the middle this bearded figure. This is Agamemnon, the king of the sort of leader of the Greeks, with his scepter. And he is in the middle, physically trying to keep the two apart. He's got his right arm extended, looking back, trying to kind of keep Ajax and Odysseus from attacking one another. And in this other detail on the left of the cup, you can see one of the Greeks having to hold on to Ajax's arm. Ajax has drawn his sword already, which you can see, the blade, and he's physically having to wrench him and to stop him from attacking Odysseus. As I said, this is another cup, same date, attributed to the same painter, in which you see this scene a bit more clearly. You see the two warriors, Ajax and Odysseus, on either side with swords drawn, determined to attack one another, and the Greeks are trying physically to keep them apart. And this is a crisis moment. As I said, the Greeks have been at Troy for 10 years. They've had to bury their greatest hero. They really need to get back to business and try to conquer the city and to fulfill their aims at Troy. The last thing they need is for their leading warriors, Ajax and Odysseus, to be squabbling like teenagers, and things to becoming factionalized and bitter within the Greek camp. So this is, to say, a real crisis point, a real kind of crux moment. The other side of the cup, the other side of the Getty Cup and this cup in London, show you what the Greeks did next. And I show you here the Getty Cup. And in short, they put matters to a vote. So they find, if you will, a peaceful resolution, a kind of a democratic, for want of a better phrase, given this is the early 5th century in Athens, way of deciding between these two competing and equally valid claims. And so what you see here, and again, this is missing the left half, but I'll show you the London Cup in a moment, which is more fully preserved. But you see members of the Greek camp coming up to a low platform and depositing their ballots. And in this case, the ballots take the form of little tiny pebbles, and you can see them perhaps most clearly on the right-hand side, piling up these little round dots. And so the Greeks are placing their vote on one side for Ajax, on the other side for Odysseus. And if you look on the far right, there's a tree, the kind of stumpy tree on the right-hand side. And behind that tree, you can actually see Ajax, who is watching the vote. And you'll see he has his hand to his head because he is seeing what we can see. And on his side, there are 14 pebbles. And on Odysseus' side, there are 15. So he sees that he is about to lose the vote. And the same thing is true on the cup in London, where you see it a little bit more well preserved with the goddess Athena in the middle. Again, the Greeks coming to make their vote, and Ajax again on the right-hand side, shrouded in his drapery as if he's in mourning, looking ahead to his defeat with his hand to his head. And I think Odysseus, you see on the far left, looking on maybe a little bit more smugly now that he can see that he is about to win. So as you see, this is the way the vote turns out. Odysseus will win, Ajax will lose. And to sort of cut to the chase, Ajax, in a fit of frustration, of feeling dishonored and disrespected, resolves to take his vengeance on the members of the Greek camp. He has a plan to kill Agamemnon and Diomedes and Odysseus and Menelaus. What happens, in fact, is the gods confuse his wits. They send him mad. He ends up killing all the cattle, the sheep, and the flocks. And he comes out of this madness and is so ashamed, so overpowered by the situation that he finds himself in, that he resolves ultimately the only way that he can reclaim some of his, I suppose, heroic status, some of his self-esteem, is by, I suppose, regaining control of his own narrative and going out into the shoreline and fixing the sword in the ground and falling upon it. And in this single cup, on this one vessel, almost like the episodes of a, shall we say, a podcast or a TV story, these different episodes in Ajax's story are plotted out in this, what I think is incredibly dynamic and engaging sort of storytelling way that would be, again, fundamental to the experience of using this cup in, say, a symposium. Two things before I wrap up. I showed you the two scenes on the cup in London. As I said, this is painted at the same time, we believe by the same painter, and there are actually other cups that show, again, the quarrel and the vote on the outside. And what you might be wondering is, well, what does the inside of this cup show? Well, I will show you. Not, in fact, the suicide of Ajax, but a different episode. And actually, it's not quite clear who is depicted here, but one plausible thesis, one plausible interpretation is that the woman on the left is Tecmessa, who we saw earlier covering the body of Ajax, here being led away by Ajax's brother or another of his Greek comrades after the suicide. So it provides um, another episode, another part of the narrative. And so you see the ways in which perhaps the painter can sort of shuffle the stories around in a way and tell or provide an opportunity to tell different moments and to highlight different episodes of this story. One last thing for now. I've focused a lot on sort of these various phases in the story of Ajax, and in particularly on this kind of climactic moment of the discovery of his body, as you see on the cup at the Getty. And I sort of think of this as this kind of scene-stealing conclusion to whatever, to the film or to the TV story, to bring it up to modern terms, or to the staged version. And this kind of, you can imagine the kind of credits rolling as you see this scene. 40 or 50 years earlier, another Greek artist, also in Athens, took a slightly different approach to this whole story. This is an amphora, now in Bologna, in France, in a museum, that, as I say, shows a slightly different moment, but one that is almost, I would say, even more powerful, even more compelling. And what you see here is Ajax in those final moments fixing the sword in the ground. You can see he's piled up his armor on the right, and he is carefully, just look at the detail as he places with his right hand, he sort of pats down that mound of earth, fixing the sword in the ground, determinedly looking at the blade, contemplating, I would say, his life and the events that have brought him up to this, and his decision to take his own life in this way. So again, this is a remarkable scene. It's pretty exceptional in Greek vase painting, but again shows you the narrative potential of these images, which at bottom is why I enjoy talking about them, and why I look forward to your questions in what follows. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, so much, and for the really close look at details people might not understand usually. That's really helpful. We have a number of questions already. One person comments that these are really fascinating stories, and that it's so interesting to think of drinkers holding cups or looking at vessels like this. And do you think that this reflects a love of dramatic conflict or moral lessons, or that people sometimes didn't even care about what it was, they were just drinking the wine? Or what do you think the role of the image really played?
Yeah, that's a very good observation, and I think all of those options are viable. Again, we would love for a time machine to be able to go back to one of these symposia and experience what happened. We have, a few literary accounts here and there, and you have things like Plato's Symposium, which give you a flavor of the kind of conversations that might unfurl. But as all of you know, from every social event you might go to every dinner party or every evening spent in company with friends, the conversations go in different directions depending on who's there, depending on how much you might be drinking, what you might be eating, and so it really is really open, I think, to exploration. But I think it's evident to me that these images of Greek heroes, of episodes from the Trojan cycle, from other narratives, Theseus, for example, Heracles, these are figures, these are individuals who are, to use a phrase that sort of is often used, they're good to think with. They're interesting to talk about. They can provide examples of how to behave, how not to behave, and can really, I think, provide food for thought, for want of a better phrase. Um, and so it's, yeah, so all of those options are there literally on the table. And but particularly when you're thinking of the symposium, at the center of a symposium would be a big mixing vessel, which everyone would be seated around, everyone could see. And so I think, yes, absolutely, these images could provide prompts for discussion, for conversation. And again, with Ajax's act, um, is this something that a hero should do? Is this a way out of a situation that people should emulate, that people should look up to? It provides this really kind of complicated test case. And in the same way with Greek drama, with the plays of either the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles or Euripides or the comedies of Aristophanes, it's a theatre, a setting to kind of test things, to kind of explore things that maybe would be too difficult to deal with in real life, but provides a sort of a framework, a safe space to talk about these unthinkable or improbable or speculative um, moral or ethical or aspirational quandaries.
There's a question of, I'm going to try to jump around among these and connect some that work within the same sort of theme. So there's a question about whether the cups could have belonged to a more complete set with additional parts of the story.
Uh, that's a great question. In this case, one of the challenges with working with this material, and certainly with this cup, we don't know its original context, and so being able to pin down what else it might have been seen with is necessarily a speculative venture. There is one, and this is a substantial kind of problem, writ large for this material. In recent decades, there's been one in recent in the last decade. There's been one really great study which I can recommend by our colleague Kathleen Lynch, who published a household deposit from the Athenian Agora, which provides a very rare snapshot of what an individual household might have had. So it's really their home, their sort of home possessions. And so we have from that house, and Kathleen details this in her book, which I would unreservedly recommend. Looks at all of these individual vessels and thinks about how they might have been seen together as a group, and the possibility that two or three could have been bought together as a single set, that they could have been seen together, and to really conceptualize as an assemblage. So it's certainly, I think, possible. The other challenge is, again, there are so many things we don't know. I've shown you this particular painter, the Brygos painter, painted at least two of these vessels with the same scenes on the outside, different scenes on the middle. His contemporaries, we have other examples, again, with the exterior, with these scenes and other episodes on the interior. So, are these painters producing them in a series? And then what happens to them? Do they get divided up on the market? Are they then taken to different places? In many cases, these vessels are being transported to Italy, to the Etruscans, where they may get reused or used and then deposited in tombs. And indeed, in those new Etruscan settings, these narrative episodes might be paired or juxtaposed with other scenes. So there's all sorts of ways in which this particular narrative unit might be repackaged, juxtaposed in different ways. And I hasten to add, it may be that the imagery is less significant than the actual shape itself. And what might be more important is the fact that this is a cup. and the scenes might be secondary. So there are lots of ways to kind of slice that pie, but these are precisely the questions that at least keep me coming back to this object.
And I'm going to jump to, did he die by the sword specifically because he was a warrior?
Go to this scene so we can talk about it. Absolutely. I mean, the sword is um, you know, part and parcel, if you will, of Ajax's identity as a warrior. Um, it actually sort of provides a narrative link because earlier in the stories at Troy, there'd been an exchange of weapons, I think, between Ajax and Hector. So there is a sort of a deeper connection. But this is again um, his way of I suppose asserting his it's the way he controls it's the way he shapes his story as he had done in life, I suppose. One little detail which I neglected to pass over, um, but some of you, and maybe this is a question in the chat, um, these other scenes of Ajax's suicide show him fallen forward on his sword. So it's fixed in the ground and he's lying prostrate over it. What's unusual about our scene is that it's actually going in through his back. And this seems rather difficult to accomplish as a kind of, you have to sort of fall backwards onto your sword, which seems very complicated. Um, One detail I think which is pertinent here is that at least in some versions of this story, and one thing I should say, and we should always say when we're dealing with Greek myth, is that there are all sorts of different variations side by side and variants. And sometimes they get written down, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we hear about them later. Sometimes they're in conflict. But there is, at least in some versions of the story of Ajax's life, he himself is invulnerable apart from at a particular point. And there is actually a great Etruscan scene, I think it's on a mirror, where Ajax is shown trying to stab himself, and the sword is actually bent because his body is impermeable. In this case, on our cup, my surmise is that this is the sort of it's a difficult way of stabbing yourself, but Ajax has to do it this way because this is the spot where he is invulnerable. This is the one spot where he can be wounded, and so this accounts, I would suggest, for this um, unusual way of presenting his death.
Are there value judgments about suicide in the ancient world? In other words, is there shameful suicide as well as a more honorable kind of suicide?
I think absolutely, yeah. And I think, and again, this is where the um, patchy and sporadic nature of evidence becomes so challenging, and certainly in later writers like Plato and Aristotle, there are discussions about um, suicide and its moral and ethical standing, and certainly amongst certain traditions like Orphic and Pythagoreans, there is a real, I think, a strong prohibition. Earlier, where we simply don't have the evidence, it's of course harder to tell. I think one thing with Ajax is there is no, at least from what we have in terms of written evidence, and again, this is a myth. This is obviously a fictional story, but there is no real, as I see it, value assessment of him once he's killed himself. In no way is it treated as a brave act, something to aspire to. There is no sense of this is a sort of morally positive way out. On the other hand, he, like many figures in Greek myth, when faced with an intractable situation, as they see it, opt for suicide as a way to preserve their what they see as integrity. And I think this is what these myths allow people to do, is to sort of think through kind of whether this is a positive virtuous act or not. As I said, later, where we have philosophical texts, we can glean a little bit more as to the standing of suicide. Likewise, it poses challenges from a legal situation. Suicides exist in this kind of difficult middle ground between kind of they are not a what we would call today a good death, and in some cases there is discussion as to how to bury the body, whether the body should be given a proper grave. I think there's at least one Athenian source that makes mention that for bodies of suicides they would cut off, I think, the right hand before burying it, presumably to ensure that it can do no more damage in the afterlife. There is a sense that the spirit of the deceased might be, in some cases, not fully at rest. So there is this discomfort with suicide, but this is precisely, I think, uh, why a cup like this is so powerful. It provides this opportunity to explore these themes, and this is true of all of the Greek heroes. Do they provide models for living day to day? And I say likewise with Greek tragedy and Greek comedy.
There's a request for you to elaborate a little more on the rituals of honoring the dead. The red figure, Kylix, is showing someone rushing to cover respectfully, and there are other rituals that seem to matter whether you're dying a natural death or in war or by suicide. Are there distinctions? What can you tell us about the practice of honoring the dead?
That's, I mean, that,
A
that's
big
a whole
question.
session. It's a whole session itself. I mean, certainly for Greek heroes who provide, if you will, again, that kind of template. We're fortunate in some ways. The Iliad gives us this um, description um, of the funeral of Patroclus. So Achilles' close friend and lover, he is given the most high status burial, and it is an enormous affair. There are games and events following it. There is, the building of a pyre. There are sacrifices. This is really a kind of monumental, really a kind of display. And it's then interesting when you sort of look into the archaeological record and you see this being emulated. And, I say this having sort of just finished working on a project looking at burial practices in southern Italy, where many of these Greek myths are very powerful and very redolent. And again, you see members of the local elite being buried with rich assemblages of pottery, elaborate grave goods, of armor, of jewelry, women being buried with amber and bronze jewels, ointment vessels, and really and I think it's true still today. Um, the funeral provides an opportunity to celebrate the dead, and particularly for those who could afford it, for those who were at the apex in their society, in their community, they were treated with the honor and respect, both at the burial itself and then in the events that followed, both in the days immediately afterwards and then subsequently in the months and years following. And there are various trends. In some periods or in some communities, the body is buried, what we call inhumed. In others, it is cremated, and that may change over time or in society to society. Um, but at least for the most elite, there is the potential for these very elaborate burial ceremonies. For those who could not afford it, of course, it was a much more potentially minimal affair, and death might be simply, a mound on the ground or a sort of a small sarcophagus in the ground. And when we are studying these ancient cultures today, one of the challenges is analyzing this and recognizing it that by and large, it is the individuals who could afford the more lavish burials, those in stone, those with objects that survive, that we can document today, and that for many people we simply don't know, because the burial might be a mound of earth or something made of wood, and we simply can't, that does not survive. So trying to unpack these complexities of funerary customs is one of the big challenges.
Thank you for the detail. That's very helpful, I think, for people to understand the big picture. Um, I'll change gears for a minute and ask you a very interesting question. Who really deserved to receive that armor? This is your opinion, obviously.
My opinion, as I have to say, Odysseus is a devious, cunning so and so, and short answer, Ajax, and particularly because there are lots of other scenes that show actually Ajax doing all the schlepping, doing the real hard work, and it's Odysseus who swoops in to get the prize, and he keeps doing this in lots of other narratives, lots of other stories. And this, what's interesting, what makes it a really good question, is actually between Ajax and Odysseus, you have, if you will, the two different poles of what it means to be a Greek hero. Ajax is all brawn, he's all strength, he's all mightiness, he's fierceness, he's power. He is, the person who is fighting in the front line and achieving wonderful, great things um, through his sheer brute strength. He is also impetuous and uncontrollable. Odysseus, on the other hand, may not have that brute strength, he may not have that brawn, but he has that cunning. He has that, shall we say, that he has that intellect, and the way in which he can play the crowd. And it's no surprise that it's Odysseus who comes up with the ruse of the Trojan horse. He is the one who can, the Greeks have been fighting for 10 years and throwing Achilles and Ajax at the Trojans to no avail. And it's Odysseus who comes up with a clever device. And he's the guy you want on your side, but he can also pull a fast one on you. And, I wouldn't trust Odysseus with my lunch.
All right. Well, we're going to have a conversation afterwards about Odysseus, the
But if
Homeric
but if
Odysseus.
if those wanting want to vote, and we can take a quick poll, if we have a medium for that, that would obviously be key to
Oh,
know.
I don't think I have a poll that I can use, but feel free to respond about that at the end, everybody, in question form if you like. Um, could you explain a little bit about how vase painters chose topics and selected scenes to depict? Another very large, complicated question that you have inspired.
Um, Again, it's where I yearn for a time machine, and we just simply, that whole process of coming up with imagery is one. In fact, I'm trying to write a little bit. I'm thinking about through this at the moment. Um, in very few cases, we can speak of a special commission where we can tell through usually an inscription that someone has actually, that a painter or a potter has actually made something for someone. So you imagine that there is some kind of discussion. But those are truly exceptional. For the most part, um, they are producing potentially for a broad market, and I guess responding to what they know sells. And there is, in many cases, a very broad correlation between, say, the function of a vessel and the imagery. So, objects that were, say, used for marriage will often have wedding scenes. Objects that were used, say, for funerals might have funerary scenes. There are certain kind of safe bets. Going a step further, so many Athenian pots are made for the symposium, in which wine is important. So Dionysus is always a surefire hit. Likewise, figures like Eros or Nike are always going to be a safe bet. Um, so there are certain kind of parameters we can draw. What's interesting is that you see trends emerging, and what's really interesting with this sort of cluster of scenes, actually go the other way. As I mentioned, this is one of, I think, at least 9 or 10 images of the fight and of the duel and the vote for armor produced at this time. So clearly there was something in the air in the early 5th century, and whether it's something to do with the emergence of democracy and voting, whether there is a new version of this story, whether there is some sort of other artistic precedent, but something um, is in the water, if you will, for a few decades in this period, and then all of a sudden they stop producing this scene. So it's again really interesting to know the mechanics behind this. One little detail, again, this gets into the weeds, but there was an article, I think just last year in the American Journal of Archaeology by Mario Iozzo, which drew attention to a vase of around the same date, where it's been revealed through imaging techniques that actually painted, written on the surface before the vase was painted, was a phrase that seems to have been the potter's instruction for what the painter should paint. So actually, the potter is providing a kind of prompt for the painter to choose a scene. Now, whether this is typical, whether this is sort of standard practice, again, is something to dig deeper. And the author Mario Iozzo provides a few other examples. But again, we would love to know that kind of dynamic within the Potter's Quarter and exactly how these scenes were chosen. But ultimately, these are potters and painters producing for a market. They are producing objects that will sell. And to that extent, they are playing safe. They are playing to what is of interest at the time and what they know will be of interest and appeal to their consumers.
We're nearing our end, but we have a few more questions. Somebody commented that the Underworld exhibition was great, and where does Ajax fit in the Underworld?
Good question. In the Odyssey, we have that episode, that extraordinary episode, which is our first at least record in Greek sources of the afterlife and the underworld. And if you read that, there is this incredibly powerful moment where Odysseus actually encounters Ajax in the underworld, and he won't speak to him. He stands there, and amongst all the other Greeks, and they're all coming to meet, or some of them are coming to meet Odysseus, but Ajax will not talk, and so this is a grudge that goes down into the afterlife and is perpetuated forever after.
Could women commit suicide as a way to regain control and honor?
Yeah, and again, this is why I invoke Greek tragedy. You think of Antigone. There are many Greek, many sort of tragedies by Euripides, Sophocles, Ajax, in which women are placed in incredibly difficult moral and ethical quandaries, and that is the way they contemplate regaining control of their narrative. So again, at least on the tragic stage, that is a pathway that is explored. Again, what we know of from ancient historical sources, from narratives, is again it's much harder to pin down, and the incidence of such rates, I'm not sure that we have, say, numbers that we could call upon, but certainly as a topic for conversation, if you will, in the setting of the Greek theatre, absolutely.
I'm just going to comment that only one person voted in the Ajax Odysseus competition. It was for Ajax. I'm all alone in voting for Odysseus, so we need to pursue this later. Um, have people considered Ajax possibly to have been suffering from PTSD? I mean, in modern
There's
times?
a there's a lot of really good work on Greek and Trojan heroes in general, and particularly specialists and scholars drawing parallels with soldiers coming back from Vietnam. There's been a lot of work that's been done on assessing Ajax and Achilles and others in light of the experiences that they've undergone, and likewise with many modern stagings of Sophocles' Ajax. Um, Contemporary settings and contemporary reflections on post-traumatic stress disorder has been a subject of attention. And actually, the British Museum a couple of years ago did a show on the Trojan War, and amongst the labels in the gallery, they included commentary from veterans, from survivors, providing their reflections on these Greek narratives, and so it provided this really powerful and compelling lens to kind of approach these scenes in a sensitive way in light of what we understand about how the mind and how the body processes these traumatic experiences.
Thank you. And our last question is going to be, how did you become interested in this topic and in your dissertation topic?
I think the reason I still work on these things is I'm still trying to work out. I think generally, and this is true, and Shelby I'm sure will agree with me that in trying to understand any other culture, particularly ancient ones, how they think about death in all of its manifestations is potentially one of the richest ways to kind of dig into differences, into shared experiences, and I think it provides a. I mean, again, it's sadly one of the few common things we all have as humanity, and so it provides a, shall we say, laboratory and a way of exploring, grappling with these different cultures in a way that allows us to at least draw some preliminary conclusions. But plainly, there is still, and yet at the same time, acknowledging that death and the afterlife is the ultimate unknowability. So there is always a sense of one's own humility and the ignorance that still I have and continues to shape to shape and inform the work that we do.
This is a good moment to remind everybody that you are going to be publishing the book that was inspired by the Underworld exhibition. Do you know the title? What is the title going to be?
Shameless plug.
Wait,
Shameless, absolutely shameless.
Underworld
Underworld,
is.
imagining the afterlife in South Italian vase painting. That
Wait,
will
is
be
it
out in the
out?
new year. It will be
Okay.
out in the new year. It's available for pre-order at all good booksellers. Thank you, Shelby, for that unexpected but opportunity for a shameless plug. But thank you.
That's great. I'm glad you got to do the plug. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us for this true crime topic, which was really, really interesting. Thank you, David, for all your thoughtful comments. I hope we'll see everybody at some more talks and events, and come to the Getty Villa as soon as you can to look at our vase collection. Bye bye.